Hey guys, welcome to this video. Thank you so much for tuning in, sharing in this now moment with myself and with one another. If you haven't seen these videos before, welcome back. If you have, my intention is unity and oneness. I just want to go into a little flow with the guides, but I also do want to give a little bit of an energetic update. I've just been kind of popping in here and there whenever I have some free time. And there's so much going on in my world. I'm sure there's a lot going on in your world. It's hard to keep up, right? There's so many people that are sharing messages. I don't know about you guys, but if you pop onto social media, do you get overwhelmed? I do. I have a hard time even just keeping my videos going on my channel, let alone following everybody else's. And I find myself shying away a bit from looking into it so that I can kind of get my own messages anyways and not be influenced by other people's messages. But simultaneously, I find myself in alignment with many other, if you want to call it channelers. I just tune into the field. I tune into my energetic flow where I feel my heart open. I feel myself expand, and I essentially drop into a synchronization in which my word flow kind of matches that frequency of love. And if you want to call that channeling, if you want to call it being in flow, I'm just so at this stage of my life, my goal, my intention is just to be in that state and share any messages that come through while I'm holding that state. And there's so many things right now. It's that everything here now all at once. We're all going through something. We're all experiencing things in our lives right now that are challenging. This is not some sunshine and rainbows journey. Even if we are feeling that state of bliss and love, that doesn't mean we aren't experiencing frustrations simultaneously. And I know that's a question like, well, how can I stay in a state of bliss and love even if I'm going through the loss of a loved one? And obviously, in that state, you may not be feeling bliss, but you also might be able to experience a sense of peace that maybe was unfelt before, because you're able to find harmony or balance somehow, even though we're experiencing a great loss. And that can be a whole conversation topic right there. Am I personally able to balance that out? I don't think I'm there yet. Sometimes I can and sometimes I can't, or sometimes I can or I do would be a better way of saying it. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. It's never a matter of I can always, or it's not that I can't. It's just that that's not the experience that I hold. I'm doing the best that I'm able to do in this now moment. And that's all we can do from one perspective, or all we are able to do from one perspective is do the best that we are able to do, because we have sometimes these expectations that we put on ourselves to always be in that high state of bliss and sunshine and rainbows. And I had somebody, a very close friend of mine, go through some grief recently, and they said, how do you process, not how do you process, how do you go through this? Like, how am I going to get through this? And my first answer that came in was, you're going to get through it when you get through it. It's not a timestamp on it. And don't hold back. If you need to cry, cry. If you feel sad, feel sad. If you're, don't get angry at yourself for having these emotions. Don't get frustrated with yourself for feeling grief. Feel grief. Allow it to be something that you're aware of and acknowledge it. And in that acknowledgement, sometimes we have to go down to that space in order to come up from it. And that was just something that came up this week. And there are different stages of grieving, and everybody grieves differently. So don't judge your experience based on what somebody else's experience is. Also, I feel called to say that I say there's no timestamp or no timeline, but there is an element of being able to live life and slowly find the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, in which we can somehow find our way back out of the grief in order to be a good friend, in order to be a parent, in order to be a spouse, whatever it might be, not only to fulfill those roles, but to be present with the rest of our lives. So there is a balance to all of this. And one of the things I've been noticing is we're all in the process of learning that balance, or remembering that balance. I think sometimes, people will say very flippantly, well, get over it, or uh, go there and, don't let anybody else tell you you have to be happy. You don't have to be happy. Those are very big extremes. And so we're being called to find that essentially coherence. And I'm being called to just share briefly. I'm just going to roll right into this, I suppose. Sometimes we talk about coherence and we hear heart coherence, and there's this assumption that it's being in a state of, bliss. Now, my definition of bliss is different than other people's, but let's just say that oftentimes we're like, okay, let's find that coherence. So that means that we're going to just stay equal the whole time. And I just want to point out the definition, according to the dictionary of coherence, is the quality of forming a unified whole. So WHOLE, like it's the entirety of it. And so I think that's important because we're not in a place of coherence if we're in a place of denial. That is us essentially not being one with ourselves. We're ignoring part of ourselves. Or if we're in a place, I can't look at that, I can't look at that, I have to stay happy, I have to stay happy. That isn't coherence. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. So we'll play with etymology briefly. Harmonious, sticking together, connected, consistent. So, recognizing that sometimes we can be in a state of coherence while we're experiencing grief, while we're experiencing feelings of whatever it is we're experiencing. I'm bringing this up because not only are a lot of us going through grief, we're going through a state of people, loved ones. We have friends and family that might be ill. We might have lost, a friend or family member, or loss of a pet. We might be sad over the state of, we're grieving over what we're witnessing happening in the world. There's all these different levels, stages, and reasons that people will experience grief. And I think that that's something important. Because if we look at what grief, the etymology of grief is to make heavy, according to this overview. So it's to make heavy, weight. It has weight to it. It can be thought of as oppressive sadness. So it's just important. We can go, that's a very broad overview, but burden, oppress, make heavy, pain, sorrow, dismay, can also be an exclamation of surprise, good grief. What do we add in front of it? So heavy is the root for the most part. But I also want to play with that because it also talks about a unit of pressure. And the reason I'm bringing this up is sometimes that grief is that pressure. And what happens with pressure is it creates change. I'm hearing that song, Under Pressure, Under Pressure. So through pressure, we have resistance, we have give, so it's part of something that is actually creating movement at times. And so I just want to say, this is, I think, relevant because a lot of people are in a space of that, and they may not have lost anyone or anything in their lives that are causing them that. They just feel this weight on them. They feel the weight of the world. And so this is just something to keep in mind, that maybe if we can, in some cases, only thing that will heal that, if, for example, it's the loss of a loved one or a pet, is time, if we want to call it that. Experiences that we have moment to moment that eventually add up enough to outweigh the grief from one perspective, and to kind of pull us up into a different perspective, where we can then feel farther away from that exact moment when the grief occurred. And so that's something to keep in mind also. So from my perspective, it's not time that heals all wounds. It's the experiences over the course from one moment to another, in which that is what uplifts us from the grief, but we're still feeling the heaviness. We're still experiencing, it's still there. It just becomes lighter with time. with these experiences. And in addition to that, we feel like we're processing while we go through these experiences. And that's my perspective around that. So this can be applicable or applied to that heavy weight. Sometimes we just have to, I'm hearing weight, be in that space of acknowledging something is weighing on us. And even that acknowledgement is and recognition can in some cases lighten the load, because essentially that heaviness, we'll call it dark, it's the sluggish, it's heavy. We're lightening that weight that we're bearing, and that light shines on it, making it lighter. So I'm playing with the words here. And I think this is really important for us to recognize that it's going to take what it's going to take as far as the time. But simultaneously, we're also being called to acknowledge that light, meaning there are, in some cases, we're given these opportunities to work through the group. We're being given these opportunities to work through the grief and essentially create new patterns, to create new harmonious interactions, to essentially welcome new experiences. It doesn't have to be in place of the grief. It can be alongside of it. It can be mixed with it, right? Moments of happiness, moments of sadness. And that is, in essence, becoming whole, complete, and not pushing those. So sometimes what's happening is people are not acknowledging the grief and their sunshine and rainbows, but in other cases, they're not acknowledging the light either. They refuse to acknowledge it or don't. This is a relevant topic, and I'll give another example, because this isn't just about grief. It's also about success. I've been noticing a lot of people in session lately that I'm working with, and I notice this in myself too. Everything I do, for the most part, so most of the things I do or I help other people with is through experience. Now, granted, I do channel and I tune into other people's guides and things like that, but so I'll get really valuable pieces of information that maybe I've never brought into my reality, but they're useful. But for a lot of the things that I don't know, that I help people with, I guess you could say, is experiential. I'm experiencing it, I'm processing, I've been through it, I will go through it. How would that feel if I were in it? I mean, there's just a lot of ways you can experience something. Okay, so having said that, I notice a lot of us, we don't necessarily give ourselves the credit where credit is due. And that's a play on words. So it's like, okay, credit is due. And we're like, nope, not going to take it. I'm not going to accept that. I don't deserve it. Or, yeah, that was a success. Okay, that person was nice to me. I'll give that example. Nobody likes me. Nobody understands me. But you have this moment, let's say, where I understand you. So I can't be the only one. And most of the time, if that's the case, and people say, well, you are the only one, which doesn't usually happen, that means that somebody else understands you too. You just haven't necessarily accepted that, or you haven't seen it because, and I'm not saying you, we all do this from time to time. Many of us have done it. And we may not be in a place where we're accepting that. We're not receiving that. So we don't see it. And we stay in that place of, woe is me, nobody likes me, nobody understands me, or I can't move out of my grief because there is no light. Because we're not accepting that there is light, we're not receiving it. Because we're so wrapped up, tightly wound, that light cannot penetrate the density or the weight of whatever it is that we're feeling, seeing, looking at, looking through. And I'm going to say that could be change of a job. It could be the world situation. We don't think, and that was one of the messages that come through. Change can happen, and it can happen from people that you would least expect it to happen from. And I'm starting to see it in in humans. I'm starting to see people come to a moment in their lives that they've never experienced before that shakes them so much that they're never the same person again. And because of that moment, that aha, that moment of clarity, and I'm going to use even just somebody being nice. Let's say somebody's been in a really dark place. People were nice to them, they never saw it. One day that cracks, that heaviness cracks, that light gets in and somebody's nice to them and they go, wow, that person was just really nice to me. Maybe things aren't as bad as I thought they were. And just in that split second, that cracks them just enough to where it starts to fall away. I'm seeing like a, an old statue that starts to crumble and the real person starts to come out and go, wow, I never saw that before. And then all of a sudden they start walking around and everybody's nice to them. Wow, it must just be one of those days. Or it might be that your perspective has changed. And so now you're recognizing the goodness in people. You're recognizing that people are actually recognizing you. Whereas before you felt that, or I felt, or he felt, or she felt that no one saw us for who we really were. So these are all things to keep in mind. I'm using this as a very across the board. I'm trying to kind of touch on, make this a wheelhouse of fill in the blanks for whatever we might be blocking, not receiving, not willing to look at, not willing to, and when I say not willing, that's a play on words. I wish I could remember the quote I was listening to. Somebody was saying we need to start thinking of language as a living architecture. They used a different word versus just a tool. And of course, I've been saying that for quite some time in my own way. So what was the word I was going to look up? So I said, we're not willing to. Well, what does that really mean? Well, we don't wish. Willing comes from the word wish. But that's funny because a lot of people go, well, I wish that was different, but it isn't. Well, let's go a little deeper. It also means choosing. So the choice, that will to allow, we're making a choice, whether it's conscious or unconscious, whether we are going to see the light, whether we are going to react to what's happening, whether we're going to allow ourselves to feel love. And I know that when we're in it, I'm not going into a space of talking about, we've lost a loved one. That's a very different can of worms. Let's just say that we're unhappy with the state of the world, or we just went through a breakup. We're going through grief because of one of those things. Those are two very different, well, all of those are different layers and types of grief. So the question becomes our will. What are we going to choose? And we might choose to be sad, but at least acknowledging that we have a choice in most cases is really important. Now, in some cases, we don't feel that we have a choice. And when we're in a deep state of grief, I don't really feel like we do. I've been in such a state that I couldn't choose in that moment to be happy if I wanted to. And that is that balance, that finding ourselves in that space and allowing ourselves to feel that we feel helpless, or that we feel that we're unable to work through it in that moment. And that might be true in that moment to me. But then 3 or 4 days later, if someone is kind and brings me, let's say, a homemade meal or gives me a gift, I can choose in that moment, while I'm feeling this grief, to recognize their love, to receive their gift. And in that moment, it shines a light and it just lifts the weight just a little bit, if I can allow it to. And this also goes to other topics that I've been working with people on, which is oftentimes people don't going back to give credit where credit is due. It's like, can we take a moment and appreciate ourselves? Like, wow, I was miserable 3 days ago. I'm actually not as heavy today. I feel a little bit better. Recognizing that, acknowledging that, and giving that credit in that moment to the moment. Doesn't have to be because of us. It might be because of somebody else. We don't have to know the reason why we feel better. We just recognize that we do. And each of those little moments add up. They're due, D-U-E, time, right? Think about all of the things that are related with the word due, D-U-E. And then what happens is one day we go, wow, I feel so much better today. And it's important in that moment not to go backwards, right? Not to go back into time and rehash. But yesterday I was so miserable and I can't believe that that person said that to me. And oh, here we go. I guess I'm not ready to. So we can acknowledge in that moment that we're remembering that feeling, that we're remembering how we were treated or mistreated or not treated or ignored, or you know what I mean? Whatever it might be. And we can remember what happened a year ago with the political realm, and we can either choose to keep bringing it up and bringing it up and bringing it up, whatever that might be for us, the polarity that we're all experiencing. And in that moment, we can just say, all right, that I do feel better than I did then. For whatever reason, I shouldn't feel better. That's another thing that comes up. I get told a lot of times from people that I work with, but I shouldn't feel this way. Why not? Why shouldn't you? And sometimes that's a really valuable question to ask ourselves. Why shouldn't I feel this way? Because by asking that question, right, it gives us answers. And sometimes we recognize, that could be a whole video in itself, right? I shouldn't be so happy because everybody else is unhappy. Why not? Who set those rules up? You did. So in this moment, you can make a choice to respond and create your own happiness, or allow the creations that are all around you to control you, to control your happiness. Is that what we really want? So these are all important questions to ask ourselves. Why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I be happy? Now that can go to the other end too, because sometimes that's I don't know what the right word is because I'm not a psychiatrist. If I was trained as a therapist, I might know. But let's just say that from my perspective, doing intuitive work, intuitively, I sense that people have a tendency, myself included, to go, well, why shouldn't I eat that dessert? I deserve that. Why shouldn't I be happy? Why shouldn't I, whatever it might be? And in some cases, that can be an extreme also, because we might be trying to make up for, we might be overlooking something. Like, why shouldn't I have that? Well, because ultimately we know if we do have it, we're going to feel worse afterwards, or our blood sugar is too high, and if we add that to our diet, it's going to make us feel worse in the long run. Or so we're being called to look at all of these, but ask ourselves, why shouldn't I? Because even in asking that, I get an answer. Oh, because your stomach's going to be upset if you eat that. And the opposite of the spectrum is why should I feel I shouldn't feel grief, as an example. I'll go back to that. Why not? It's very natural for us to experience whatever it is we're experiencing in a lot of ways, because we're humans, we're having a human experience. So as soon as we start labeling things as should or shouldn't, according to whose or whom, right? Obviously, if it's going to hurt ourselves or hurt someone else, yes, I shouldn't pull out in front of traffic going 5 miles an hour when the speed limit's 50. Well, why shouldn't I? Because that has repercussions and is harmful potentially to other people. It's a safety issue. Common sense, but we're really being called to use our common sense, to tune into our bodies, to tune into our emotions, to recognize our feelings, right? And I'm bringing all this up because maybe you're watching this and you're not a therapist either, but you do have common sense. And so oftentimes we can help ourselves and other people by utilizing that as a baseline. I hope I've covered a lot of all over the place. That's how my communication has been lately. So thank you for bearing with me if you've made it this far, and I hope that something of what I've said so far has been helpful. So I'm going to go into a little channeled flow, the second part of this video, and kind of see what comes through. I could branch off of all of those topics onto other topics, such as throughout the day checking in with ourselves and not overlooking our successes. I'm going to kind of lead into that at a different point. I'm being called to use a couple examples. Let's say you're used to having a really bad day because there's somebody at work that you don't get along with, and that person came up to you and you didn't overreact. Not that, or you didn't react. Let's say you're not the one who's been causing the issues. This other person has been very volatile, and it seems like you guys keep butting heads. And today, for whatever reason, we didn't respond or react to their volatility by becoming volatile ourselves. That's a success. That's what the guides are talking about. That's what the field is kind of reflecting back to us. Like, okay, I didn't get upset. Wow, score for me. Because oftentimes, if we're not taking a moment to acknowledge that as a victory, we miss it. This happens with a lot of things. It happens with synchronicity. It happens in relationships. It happens in whatever else. It's not acknowledging, my partner, my spouse doesn't ever compliment me. Well, that may be true. In some cases, though, is it really true? Or is it that we aren't noticing the way in which they compliment us? And the way in which they compliment us, I'm just using, is it maybe that they wash our car or picked up groceries? They may not be using language to do it. Maybe it's through body language. It's a comforting touch, and if it's something we really want, and I'm jumping all over the place, but this came from those little victories, we can then say, I'd really love it if you would compliment me once in a while. Would that be okay with you? Would you be able to, I'd like it if I dress up, if you'd say you look really nice tonight. How hard is it to say that? Granted, there could be some issues, if the person's defensive, that's a whole other can of worms. But let's back up just for a moment. So we'll go back to the victory. So if the partner compliments us, or we could take a moment and acknowledge that and be like, wow, they actually complimented me. That feels really good. And respond accordingly. Thank you. I really appreciate your compliment. It made me feel really good. Thank you. So that's acknowledging. Not only now are you acknowledging the little victory because it gives you something that you've been looking for or craving, but it also is a reflection back to them that encourages that further. And we have to do that for ourselves, right? We are being called to, are we complimenting ourselves? Are we feeling like we did a good job? So those are all important things. It's encouragement of ourselves and encouragement of others. Okay. So many topics I could keep flowing into. Let's just go into a little flow with the guides as I have a little bit more time here. Okay. Excuse me. It's kind of bright there. All right. And so as we organize our thoughts, as we allow ourselves to become more organized in how we are reflecting on our thoughts, as we allow ourselves to move into a state of oneness with ourselves, we're coming back to the word that I used earlier, which was coherence. It allows us to gain a synchronization with the unification in the field. It allows us to recognize that there are things unifying within the field that we may have otherwise missed. It allows us to recognize there are things within ourselves that are unifying that we may have otherwise missed. Slowing down gives ourselves the opportunity to speed up. It gives ourselves the opportunity to see and recognize the resources that are all around us that we may have missed before when we were in a state of hearing the word divorce. When we are in a state of separation, when we are in a state of interrogation. Okay, this is a play on words. And I'm being called to play with that because I don't see that. So that's an example of a misunderstanding, communication. Like we hear the word interrogation, like what is this, an interrogation? Well, if you actually, so yeah, if we're in that state of why am I doing this? I don't know why I'm doing that. Uh, what's going to happen in the future? Why is this happening? That's interrogation. Slamming our hands and like, why did this happen? But I'm being called to play with interrogation actually comes from to literally to stretch out the hand. And that's not a bad thing. To ask a question, to stretch out the hand, right? Why? To receive, to ask. So rather than being in a very, I'm hearing slow down, like rather than being in this state of constantly questioning, we can ask ourselves questions without coming from an aggressive state, coming from a place of curiosity versus, I'm hearing law and order with the gavel, right? Judgment. That's what's coming through. Their guides are like, "Thou shalt not judge." Can we come from a place of open-hearted curiosity with questions in the true root of interrogation rather than this, I'm hearing, judicial system of judgment and sentencing? And that's all a play on words, you guys, like creating a sentence, syntax, a linear perception. Can we be a little bit more open versus going in a straight line, right? But what's going to happen is the more open we are, the faster we can go, and the clearer, right? The clearer it becomes the answers to our questions. And so we are being invited to recognize that we are stepping up, if you will. And the more we step up, the more we step out, the more we become more in alignment with what we are perceiving as our reality. And this is a play on words too, because the perception of truth and the perception of our reality is based directly on what we are indirectly perceiving. It's the subtleties. And if we are not giving ourselves credit where credit is due in our own lives, we are not able to see the perspective or point of view that many others are holding, that are adding to this particular glue that holds together the reality structure that each of us is intertwined within. I'm hearing birds of a feather, and then I'm seeing DNA. And so we are called to come back together and reorganize through this pattern of energy, the center of the storm, the energy, becoming more coherent with the state of the energy that we are each and every one of us bringing to the tables. There are so many different plays on words that we could go into right now. In this particular message, we are trying to stick together and hold a cohesive cohesion, a cohesive expression, rather than the word play that we are excited to present in some ways. Because once we slow down, we can open to the truth behind the words that each of us is using for communication. And we begin to recognize that the way in which we are using our communication is changing and needs to change in order to meet us where we have moved up to meet us where we are truly at. So I'm being shown that a lot of us are not as bad off as we think we are. A lot of us are not, things aren't as bad as they seem in many circumstances. That's not to say in some circumstances things aren't really difficult. But in the case of many situations, we're just being called to, I'm just hearing, band together and quit looking at the separation that is creating distortion within the syntax, within the communication that each of us is perceiving differently. And so one person may use one word and that word becomes a distorted word. And we pick up on the distortions rather than hearing the original syntax that was the reason or purpose behind using that particular language, if that makes sense. So we will continue to misinterpret the situation based on our own vibration. And if we are not allowing ourselves to come back to a place of cohesion, coherence, balance, and harmonization, even though we may be feeling some sense of disharmony, we can still see things through a harmonious perspective. So I'm being called to go back to the grief. We can still be in a state of grief, but see things as they are and not necessarily distort them because of our grief. We can still be, look, I'm really sad, but we can see the joy, let's say, of somebody who just had a baby, right? And go, oh, it's a beautiful thing. I can't wait to congratulate them, and then go back to our grieving, right? There can be a balance if we can come back to a place of unity and quit. I'm getting back to where credit is due, buying into this structure that has been truly influenced by disorganization and chaos. And no matter who is to blame, if you will, for this delusional experience that many of us are feeling as if we are somehow participating in, we are part of the creation. So we are part of that which is adding to the creation. So we are being called to recognize and reorganize from our own state of coherence so that we quit adding to the state of disharmony, if that makes sense. So this gives us an opportunity to see into a broader spectrum of many things, a broader spectrum of opportunities, a broader spectrum of our own ingenuity, an interlaced reality system that allows us to adapt a new model of how we live together and how we help one another and how we communicate with one another is the beginning of it all. For if we cannot speak in alignment with our true heart's desire, not what we've been told or we think our heart's desire is, but truly love, we cannot create the reality that we believe is truly love. For our belief is based on a non-reality. Our beliefs are based on a system that we have been taught is better than it actually is. I guess that's just what the guides are saying. Just tuning into the guides, trying to stay in flow. And so as we reorganize our center and we come back into our heart center, we begin to draw to us more of our heart's desire. We begin to draw to us what we truly desire and fan those flames instead of fanning the flames of someone else's desire that never was truly heart-centered at all. We begin to differentiate between the all and the fabrication that is only a piece of the all that many of us have been focusing on. I hope that makes sense. For there are pieces and parts of reality that we have all been focusing so much on that the density has become so massive, play on words, big and heavy, that we have been drawn to it like moths to a flame. We have been sucked into it, one might say, or our directional focus has been honed in on it for so long that we think that is the only place to focus on. And so I keep hearing there's no place like home. Come back to the home of the heart. Oh, I had a beautiful session the other day with a light worker. I just want to share briefly because I think this is so relevant. She had seen this beautiful crystal pink heart in this in when we were doing energy work together along this beautiful pathway, and there was more, and it meant something specific to her. And when I came back to the message earlier, I had done a message the day before with someone whose loved one had passed on, and I hear this a lot, like home is where the heart is, because the question I get asked a lot is my loved one hear? Can they hear me? And I'm fairly new at the whole connecting to loved ones on the other side. I mean, I'm not new at it from a multidimensional perspective, but in this lifetime, it's something that I'm still learning to, to become better at, we could say. But I can receive messages, and I'm usually in alignment with what the person was like when they were alive. And it's such a beautiful gift for me to experience them and to know these people that I've never met before, or I've only met once. Anyways, my point is, one of the biggest messages is home is where the heart is. So it's not some pie in the sky. It's not some place that many people think we necessarily go to. It's actually an energetic, and there are places we go to, but the bigger message is this is where what draws to us and attracts to us, tractor beam, through our heart-centered awareness, through our patterning in our energy field. And that is sent out as a signal, and it's a homing beacon. And somehow through that projector, that's how we end up connecting with reality. And this can include, loved ones. I know I went off on a little tangent there, but I'm just seeing kind of a theme here. It's like, get back to the heart. It's all through this that we end up growing, knowing, up-leveling our communication, feeling into our higher senses. And we then begin to clear the way, so to speak, and create a cut. I'm hearing crystal, so I'm going back to the heart, a cut crystallization, and that is crystal, crested frequency, crested, right? It becomes a jewel, if you will. I'm hearing jewel of the Nile. Let's get it back on track, Carrie. So we are being invited to step out of the norm, no longer conform to an old trajectory. And this is something we have said before, but in this moment, we are all being called to restore our true heart's connection. And when we do this, we begin to sense a deeper connection that goes beyond these false reality blueprints that we have been building essentially for the creators of these false realities in because of our unified, coherent, cohesive focus. So now if we come back into a place of heart coherence, that cohesive focus becomes much stronger. And it begins to drown out the old signals that many of us have been drowning in. It begins to become clear that we are creating new signals that are allowing us to clear out the old distortion, distorting signals that have been distracting us from our higher directive, perspective. And we are being called to listen. As we listen to this new sound coming from inside of us, we begin to birth a new reality in such a way that it is sound. It does not need anything but that which we give it, the energy that we give it, because it is pure, it is organic. It does not rely on falsified documentation, principles, or implementation that is all bells and whistles. It is the deeper sound beyond the mechanical elements that have been transposed or placed on top of the organic structure. So we are now building this from within us. I'm hearing like origami, like organic origami, like the angles and the patterns that we're creating when we stay in this place in the heart is, I'm hearing light as a feather. And ironically, I'm also hearing outweighs the weight. So it's kind of like water weighs more than, there's something about that, like water and ice. Like ice floats and the water's heavier, but they're the same, right? They just have a different chemical structure because one is frozen and one isn't. So it's, I don't know, there's something to that. But I'm going to end on that note. And hopefully you found something helpful from this transmission and sharing with you guys. Thank you so much. I appreciate you for tuning in, sharing these videos, and thank you for just being a part of this experience. In love and light, namaste.